Hey guys, I'm Logan Clements, freelance event manager, and today we're going to talk about when you need to postpone. If you're feeling overwhelmed about the whole process of having to pick an entirely new date for your event, this video is for you because I'm going to lay out the framework that I've walked countless clients through when deciding when they need to make the decision to postpone. Before we jump into it, I do want to remind you guys, if you love anything about event planning and want more tips and tricks, please subscribe below. I just keep pointing somewhere below, and you'll be able to get my new videos that I drop every single Monday with my favorite tips and tricks about event planning. Anyway, let's get back into it. Anyone who works in events knows how much effort and time is put into event planning. So when you use the P word of postpone, it can feel like the rug is getting pulled out from under all of your plans. But sometimes it can be the right thing to do. My first and overall big tip I have is earlier is always better than later. And so what does that even mean? I mean, the sooner you can tell people that you're postponing, the better prepared they can be for the change. And when I say people, this means your vendors, this means your guests, and I mean, it can even mean yourself. I know for several events that I've worked on, that limbo of not knowing, are we postponing, are we not, can sometimes be way harder to handle than just making the decision. And something I've really realized throughout this whole COVID times has been how much event planning is really just being like a professional decision maker and being comfortable with picking between option A and option B and picking A or picking B and just going with it and sticking by your decision. And so I know when you're thinking about postponing, it can feel really overwhelming to have to make that call. And I know I'm definitely grieving for what my 2020 should have been. Unfortunately, my planner is filled with a lot of crossed out events and things that should have been happening right now. And that's okay. It's okay to grieve, but it's also okay to find moments of hope in all of this craziness and challenging times to figure out when we can get back to whatever the new normal events will be. So the sooner you can make this decision, the better. And you'll find that your event, when you do execute it, whenever that is, will be better for it. And that brings me to my next tip. This is where you need to look at your contracts. I had one couple that I was talking about through their wedding planning process, and they'd asked me, well, my event's not until September. Should I even be reaching out to my vendors right now because they're so overwhelmed with all their spring and summer weddings? My advice to them was similar to what I just said, the sooner the better. Maybe your vendors won't be able to answer all of your questions right this minute. They'll have to get back to you in a week or two. But the fact that you're reaching out to them lets them know that you're still interested, they're top of mind. And if it's a vendor that's particularly important to you, let's say your venue, your caterer, your photographer, whoever that may be, I would really make sure the sooner you're thinking about, even just thinking about postponing, I would reach out to them. Because sometimes that can be a helpful guide into when you can postpone too, because if it's really important to you that you have this specific vendor and they are only available in 2020 on October 20th, well then maybe that's going to have to be your new date, and that can help decide the decision for you versus you trying to think, oh, can I just postpone it a full year? I don't know what date I would even choose. So check with your vendors. And a caveat with that too, when you check with your vendors, look at those contracts. If you've signed a contract with a vendor, they usually have a cancellation or postponement policy time. I know now with COVID, a lot of vendors are doing exceptions, whether it's allowing deposits to be applied to the new date for your event, or a portion of the non-refundable deposit to be kept and the rest of it applied to the new event, or you're only on the hook for the non-refundable deposit, but you don't have to pay the rest of your fees. This is where it's really, really helpful for you to make sure you're looking at every line by line of every contract to figure out what's the process for postponing, how much money will it cost you to postpone or not postpone, and that can help you kind of make your decision about when. I even had one client who was working with a hotel, and in the hotel's contract it says 90 days before the event date, you're on the hook for 100% of the event fee. And so that automatically gave us a postponement date where we would have to make a decision by, or we would still owe the entire event fee to the venue, which was a large chunk of what we were spending on the event, even if the event happened or not. So look at your contracts, read through the lines, try to figure out what those cancellation policies, and as always, if you have any questions whatsoever, I always recommend reaching out directly to the vendor. I'm also happy to help answer questions. So now that you've looked at some of your vendor contracts, you've talked to some of your vendors maybe, my next thing to look at would be your federal, state, and local guidelines. This is where it can get really overwhelming. I know with COVID, it seems like not every state is opening at the same rate, not every county is opening at the same rate, and sometimes the guidelines just aren't even that clear. I know I'm itching to get back to events as soon as possible, but we also want to make sure we're doing them safely because all of your guests, you want to make sure they're having a great time and can go home happy and safe. For us out here in Seattle, they seem to be changing every week or so, and so it's something just to keep a pulse and see how quickly your county is opening and what they are allowing. I know there's been a lot of weddings that are happening in people's backyards, which I think are great and beautiful and still have had the magic of a beautiful wedding day, but you need to keep in mind where this is taking place and what your local guidelines are, because like any other vendor, I know myself, I would not want to be asked to work on a wedding or an event in an area that was not allowed to be opening up or gathering in the way that we were gathering. Which brings me to my next point. Prioritize. I've done other videos and articles about prioritizing because I believe, similar to anything, you can't have it all. You can have an amazing, beautiful, awesome, mind-blowing event, but you do have to make decisions. And so here's some questions that I would kind of ask yourself when you're going through this process. Do you want your event to happen this year? Does it have to be a 2020 event? For some nonprofits, they have to have their galas, their fundraisers in 2020 because they need that for their budget to operate for the rest of the year. For some weddings, I've heard people who really, really want to have their wedding this year because the date 2020 really matters to them. That's okay. You just need to ask yourself, is this an event that has to take place this year, or could it be postponed to next year? Think about, do you want to keep your original date? Or do you want to keep your original season? Is that one date really important to you? Then there's options that you can get creative. And if your wedding date was the most important thing ever to you, just like I said earlier, there's been some beautiful backyard weddings and things that you could do to still celebrate and have your original date while then postponing your reception to later on so when people can gather the way you want them to. So it's something to think about. Another thing is if you always like to do your summer cookout and that's really, really important to you, and it really wouldn't make sense to do a fall cookout because so much of what you do is centered around the season, that's another thing to think about when you're thinking about postponing your event to 2021. And my next question is, when you do postpone, how do you want to celebrate on your original date? I think it's totally okay to do something to celebrate and mark that day and not just treat it like any other day. So like I said, there's backyard weddings, or you could do a fun takeout dinner for you and your partner from your favorite restaurant, or maybe the cutest thing I saw for one couple that they did not do their wedding on their original date. They postponed it to 2021, but their wedding party surprised them with a Zoom call. And I thought that was kind of the cutest way to still mark the date as important, acknowledge that, we're missing out on something, but the party's not over and we're still excited to see you in 2021. So there are some fun things you can do to still honor your original date while still staying true to postponing. Another thing I like to think about when we're talking about postponing is it's so easy just to kick the can down the road because it can feel so overwhelming to make that decision of postponing. You can just say, oh, we'll decide next week. Oh, we'll decide next week. We'll decide the week after that. Which brings me back to my first point where I said earlier is better than later. It helps everybody. It helps you, it helps your guests, it helps your vendors, helps everyone involved. My biggest reasons to think about when you need to make a decision date, so this isn't your new date that you're picking, this is just we're gonna set a deadline of this is when we're gonna make a decision to postpone, yes or no. So the big 3 things to think about. 1, public safety. Again, this is go back to your local, state, and federal guidelines and see, are you allowed to gather? And if you are, can you? 2, your priorities. So like we talked about, what is really important to you? Can you have and execute on all those priorities? For example, if having a really crowded dance floor that dances the night away to your band is what you really, really want, are you going to be allowed to do that with the full 100, 200 people you wanted to have there? Or on your original date, now because of public safety, you would only be able to have 50 people there. And number 3 would be financial. None of us really have events that are completely budgetless. And so I like to say, look at the money, look at your contracts, and try to see when does it make sense to make this decision financially. And I often find that your venue or your catering, whatever you're spending a majority of your event budget on, that usually will have a date associated with it where the vendor will need to know if you're postponing or not. So those are my 3 ways that you can kind of pick that decision date. And I really recommend you to pick one, because the sooner you can start to make a decision, the sooner you can refocus your efforts into making your new date as awesome as possible. And then my final question that I want to leave you guys with is, just because you can gather doesn't always mean that you should. And when I say that, I mean, rarely do we have events that are in a bubble. Rarely do you have an event that only includes people from your town, your city, your county. Often you're bringing people to your event, your wedding, your conference, your gala from all over, from multiple states, sometimes multiple countries. And is it smart to be bringing everybody together into close quarters, whether it's 6 feet or closer or farther apart, but just together, and then sending them back out into their respective homes? And then my other question would be, are your guests going to be comfortable? This is something with COVID. I know we are ways away from finding a vaccine, and it's frustrating to think that this is going to have a longer impact than it already has over these last couple months, but it's something to think about. And I know I've worked with several nonprofit clients thinking that some of their donors might be at risk, and so even if we are allowed to gather 100 people, 200 people in a room in the fall, will your guests be comfortable doing that? And if the answer is no, then maybe you need to start thinking about doing a hybrid event. So a combination of a live with a virtual aspect to your event to accommodate those guests who don't feel comfortable attending your event in person. These are just things to think about. Definitely this last question about whether you should have events really weighs heavily on me as a planner, because I work with clients who want to host events, and I'm with you, and I cannot wait until we're allowed to be all together and cheering on a sports team with like 60,000 people in a stadium. It's going to be amazing. But we're not able to do that yet. It's thinking about what's your responsibility as an event host to make sure that you are staying true to the best interest of your guests while also still being able to execute the event in the way you want to do it. So postponing can seem hard, it can seem overwhelming, and I know there's no right or wrong answer about it, and so that can probably be what's the hardest part about it. So hopefully that was really helpful. You were able to figure out a little bit more into your process about when to postpone. It's such an overwhelming decision. I know I've done a lot of hand-holding with clients just to be there to be a sounding board and help them work through these questions. It's okay to not know the answer to all of those questions right now, but I would say my biggest takeaway is that you hopefully know that you need to have a date to decide when you are postponing or when you aren't. And there's no right or wrong answer of when that date is, but back to my first point, sooner is better than later. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about my favorite tips and tricks when it comes to deciding when to postpone. And if you find any of these resources helpful, please like, comment. If you didn't find them helpful, feel free to also dislike. That just lets me know what you guys are into. And subscribe to my channel, as I will be posting videos every Monday with my favorite tips and tricks about event planning, running my own business, and I'm always interested in learning what you guys want to learn about. So let me know, and I look forward to chatting with you guys next week. Bye. How to postpone, we get so confused about